Tonight's program that is brought to you by Martin Luther King Jr. Celebration Committee here at Lehigh University. And so tonight we get to spend some time with Black Lives Matter co-founder Patrisse Cullors. And tonight's discussion will be moderated by our own Dr. Valerie Taylor, who is an experimental social psychologist, an assistant professor in psychology with a joint appointment in Africana Studies. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Taylor.
Thank you all. We are very excited to be here this evening, and especially excited to have Patrisse Cullors with us today. Just for a brief introduction, as most of you know, she is a social activist, a best-selling author of When They Call You a Terrorist, and co-creator of the viral Twitter hashtag and movement, Black Lives Matter, hashtag Black Lives Matter. So Patrisse Cullors is a New York Times bestselling author, an educator, artist, and abolitionist from Los Angeles, California. Co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, Patrisse has been on the front lines of abolitionist organizing for 20 years. Since she began the Black Lives Matter movement in 2013, it has expanded into a global foundation supporting Black-led movements in the US, UK, and Canada, and has been nominated for the 2021 Nobel Peace Prize. The significance of the Black Lives Matter movement has been recognized by the New York Times as the largest movement in US history. Times 100 named Patrisse as one of the 100 most influential people in 2020. Patrisse has led multiple Los Angeles-based organizations, such as Dignity and Power Now, Justice LA, and Reform LA Jails. Each of these organizations have won progressive ballot measures, fought against a $3.5 billion jail plan, and implemented the first ever civilian oversight commission of the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department. Patrisse is also the faculty director of Arizona's Prescott College and a new social and environmental arts practice FMA program. It's a new, social and environmental arts practice FMA program, which she developed nesting a curriculum focused on the intersection of art, social justice, and community organizing that is first of its kind in the nation. Not stopping there, Patrisse is also a former staff writer on Freedom Forum's Good Trouble series, as well as an actress on the show. She also co-produced the 12-part YouTube series entitled Resist that premiered November 18th, 2020 on the platform. In 2020, Patrisse signed an overall production deal with Warner Brothers, where she intends to continue to uplift Black stories, talent, and creators that will continue to transform the world of art and culture. Her newest book, An Abolitionist Handbook, is to be released in October 2021. So with all of that, we are really excited to have Ms. Cullors here with us today. We'll do a bit of a moderated discussion today. I'll start off with a few questions, and later on we'll field a few from the audience as well. So Great. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you.
We really appreciate your time and your energy and all you've given to us thus far. So I just want to start with a really general question before we sort of dig into anything in particular. Just want to know how you're doing, how your spirit is, how your heart is, and just where you are in these days.
Oh, wow, that's really powerful. Thank you. I have too much makeup on to tell you how I'm really doing. I'm okay. I'm in a very reflective moment in my life. I'm going to be 38 this year. It's been 8 years. I think I was 29 when I started BLM. So right in my Saturn's return for any of you astrologist or astrologist wannabes like me out there. So yeah, my heart is, my heart is achy. There's a way in which, living in this country and witnessing the state violence and being impacted by it over and over again is just really creates a lot of an achy heart. but also I feel really I feel really proud of the work that our movement has done for so long. So it's both and, it's a both and feeling.
So do you want to take a moment just to share with us a little bit about, for some people who may know a little bit less about Black Lives Matter movement, what it is, what the top priorities and goals are for the current Black Lives Matter agenda?
Sure. So, Black Lives Matter really gets created out of the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And George Zimmerman was the person who murdered Trayvon Martin. And as we created the organization as three young women, and really, put our time and energy into creating this organization, we recognized how important it was to be building an institution that could fight white supremacy. I don't think many of us realized how big of a task it was going to be. I don't think we also realized how big it was going to get. But it's very powerful, right? It's very powerful because it means that Black Lives Matter resonated for Black people, not just in this country, but across the globe. In our most recent years as Black Lives Matter, we have 3 organizations that are all separate legal entities, but are all connected. We have the Black Lives Matter Political Action Committee that can endorse candidates and also fight for Black radical legislation and abolitionist legislation. We have the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, which is our C3, which is an organization that is focused on funding and amplifying the current movement. And then the third is the Black Lives Matter Grassroots, which is chapters that used to be a part of Black Lives Matter Global Network that are now organizing separately, but closely with Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation.
Thank you. And so with that, what are some of the, this is a sort of a big question, but what are some of the top priorities that you see? I guess it's BLM Global Network has in this moment.
So number one is resourcing and supporting current Black-led movements. And so, of the money that was really granted to us this last year, we have given out almost $27 million. We also launched, given the impact of COVID-19 on Black communities, what we call the Survival Fund, where we gave out 3,000 cash grants to Black people. It was about $3 million, the Survival Fund. And then we're really interested in, supporting and uplifting thriving Black lives. We've spent a lot of time in our movement, and the media in particular, focusing on Black death. So we want to refocus us on thriving Black lives, really looking at the fight for, reparations, the fight to really invest in Black communities. We're really interested in supporting Black-led orgs and leaders, but also Black businesses, small Black businesses that really support the Black economy. And we are focused on abolition. How do we really create a world where policing and imprisonment isn't a part of what we do, but rather true safety for our communities?
That's nice. Thank you. So I want to ask a question a little bit about this summer. So during the summer, we saw many, many people participate in protests and marches for justice this last summer. And the question was, would some of these same folks, especially the young people, come out in huge numbers and vote? And of course, we know that they did. So we just like to hear a few words about your thoughts about that and what role BLM played in registering people to vote and getting them to the polls in this last election season.
We played a significant role. It was the first time that our organization in particular focused on electoral justice. And we spent a lot of time getting people to go vote. So we spent about $2 million to get people to vote. And in the work, when you do C3 work, you can only tell people to go vote. You can't tell them how to vote. And it's why we started a political action committee, because we wanted to tell people also how to vote. Like, hey, let's not vote for this other guy. Let's vote for this person. Or, here in your local community, these are the candidates that are really invested in Black life, So that became really exciting. We really spent a lot of time inside of the electoral justice space.
And I know that BLM has, and you spoke on this a little bit earlier, but BLM has raised a considerable amount of funds, and some of it's come from corporate America over the last year. And how, you spoke a little bit about how those funds have been used. Can you share a little bit more about that? And are there any strings attached or burdens or expectations that are expected from you related to these funds?
Well, I think it's important for people to know that the money that was given to us, we didn't raise it. So we didn't go out and solicit money. In fact, one day we didn't have money, and the next day we had a lot of money. And I was like, oh, I've never seen this much money in my whole entire life. But with that and those monies, coming into our organization, we were really clear. I really looked over at the staff and I said, hey, we got to get this money out the door. We need to reinvest this money as soon as we can on the ground. So we spent a ton of time really doing that and really moving that forward. There was other question around taxes.
Oh, well, just because, things are cast in a particular light in the media, right? And I know you have likely dealt with a lot of backlash in various ways. And part of this question comes from some people or others maybe being concerned, like, where does this come from? What strings are attached? And I just wanted to see if you could speak a little bit to that.
So all the money that was given to us last year came with no strings attached, which is unheard of. It was all unrestricted dollars. Much of the money, a lot of people said that corporations, but actually much of the money came from individual donors. The average donor was a $30 donor. And I think it's really given us an opportunity to try to figure out, what do we want to do next? Mm-hmm. We're going to spend the next 6 months really doing, most organizations of our size, now that we're a big organization, actually take a year to kind of go dark and look at, what's the strategy, what's the next steps, what are the best legal entities. And so we're going to spend some time over the next 6 months really trying to assess, like, what's next? What do we do now? What's the best way forward for this organization?
So related to that, what are your thoughts on how BLM might help fight voter suppression? Have you guys been thinking about that particular fight that's going on in so many states? Of course, Georgia is the one we hear about most often.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's over 200 voter laws that are focused on voter suppression. Yes, that is a big part of our work. We do lean on others who are doing that work, mostly to amplify the work that they're doing. Sometimes the best role for a big organization like BLM is to amplify the already amazing work happening on the ground, and to push people to, really challenge their electeds to push back against voter suppression. So we're definitely in that fight.
And BLM has also adopted and is advocating for the BREATHE Act. So I would like you to just tell the audience a little bit about what is the BREATHE Act and why is it so important, and what BLM has to say about it and the support of it.
Yeah, the BREATHE Act is the first omnibus bill of the movement for Black lives. And so Movement for Black Lives is actually a coalition of 100 Black-led organizations across the country. And the bill, the BREATHE Act, has not been introduced yet, but it is something that we worked on all summer to kind of talk to and reach electeds who needed to hear, what people in the streets wanted. The people in the streets, sorry, let me drink some water. The people in the streets wanted defund. They wanted to redistribute money from the police and into our communities. And that's what this bill does. And that's what this bill is looking at. It's looking at redistribution of policing and their dollars and putting that money to invest into Black communities.
So for people who don't understand what defunding the police is or have a particular understanding of it, how do you define that idea of defunding the police?
Defunding the police is specifically about looking at how police budgets have been overbloated for decades, and then looking at other social services. The police are a social service, we pay for them, and looking at how housing, people having access to employment and food have been totally defunded, underfunded, not prioritized. How do we take the money that's been given to police for often more violence on our communities? How do we take that money and then give it to social services that actually resource our communities?
Thank you. And relatedly, someone asked a question that I think is kind of pertinent to what you've been talking about, and it's related to them watching BLM, which featured you and your brother and his struggles with mental health, and highlights the work that really needs to be done to decriminalize mental health and allow for adequate health care. So what do you think in that realm is really important as it relates to defunding the police, and any other ideas about mental health and psychology, those sorts of topics?
Thank you. I'm looking at the question. It's a great question. That project was really moving and powerful for me. I didn't realize, in some ways, the director of that project really got to see the evolution of BLM through my eyes, but also the evolution of what was happening at the local level here in Los Angeles. It was a 7-year documentary. So it took 7 years to make. And it was really healing. My family and I, we all participated in it. And when we were able to cancel the McCarthy contract that was going to build a mental health jail, we also have been able to stop any new jails from being built in Los Angeles. In fact, Men's Central Jail, which is an utter disaster and so dangerous and has just created so much havoc in our communities, is going to be shut down. They're going to be closing Men's Central Jail. They're going to be getting rid of it. And that is just so powerful. It's so powerful. One of the biggest things I think when we're considering, people who experience severe mental illness, especially people of color, especially Black people, is that we have to decriminalize mental illness. We have literally made it a crime for people to be severely mentally ill in this country. And so, something that I think about a lot is, how do we do that? How do we decriminalize mental illness? How do we make this thing, this terrible, just like governmental experiment on people with mental illness? How do we stop it? And part of stopping that is decriminalizing it. I was supposed to go, but then COVID happened. How many times have y'all said that? To Trieste, Italy, where they have successfully decriminalized mental illness. And they do not put people in jail who are mentally ill. And they have a full-on wraparound healthcare system for folks. I'm really interested, hopefully in like a year, but I can go visit and check out what work they're doing there.
So that's great, and it'd be exciting to hear sort of what strategies they're putting in place to facilitate that sort of care that we know is so needed in many communities of color and other communities as well. So people have often struggled and I'm looking at one of these questions here, people have often struggled to understand what safety would look like in Black communities or other communities without the police. And we can list a whole lot of different things that go on. How will people, quote unquote, be protected without police is a big question in people's minds. So can you say a little bit about that?
Yes. Number one, there's a false narrative that the police protect us. So I think we have to remember that, right? When we say protection, what are we asking for? There's two things that I think about. There is safety from violence and harm. Physical violence, physical harm. And so yes, our communities need to be communities that we feel safe in. And there should be infrastructure that is preventative and lessens physical harm and violence versus being an interventionist. So the police are not preventative. They do not stop harm, physical harm and violence. They intervene on it, maybe. They investigate it usually afterwards. So we have to start there with our own sort of framework around how we understand the role of the police. Number two, when we're talking about what a community needs, specifically poor communities, we can't have abolition if we still live in a capitalist system. We can't have abolition if there is a class system in which some people are poor and some people are rich. Everybody has to be able to get their needs met. People need to have access to food, to education. People need to have access to housing, and all those things have to be adequate: food, housing, education. People have to have access to jobs or income. Not everybody is going to be able to work. And so people also have access to income. So in the places where there's the least amount of harm and violence, it's because people are getting their needs met, but also people are in community. They are building community. They are seeing each other as siblings, as cousins, even if they're not blood family. And we have to create that kind of system. It may sound like utopia, but I put an image on my Instagram from an artist in Minneapolis who said there was a time before police and like there will be a time after the police. And so we have to imagine that. We have to collectively imagine that.
And we know that, well, I don't know if many people know this about you too much, but you're an artist as well. And so can you talk a little bit about where art intersects with your advocacy and how you see universities being in on that project at all? And you do a little teaching too, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
I do a lot of teaching. I'm a professor and MFA faculty director at Prescott College. Yeah, I think, ask me that question one more time.
Yeah, I packed a lot in there. Let me back. Where did I start? Let's see.
Yes, where did you start?
Let's start with the art and social justice part of it. So how does your art intersect, or how do you see art intersecting with your social justice advocacy? So that's the first part of the question.
So art is at the center of what I do. Art is, a really powerful tool for our culture to help people understand complex ideas and issues, and to help us really and truly identify like what our communities need. Art is also very healing. Oftentimes allows for us to be able to understand more than what we understand if we're just reading it or listening to a speech. I was an artist before I was politicized. So I've been an artist for a really long time. And I am, my art is art that is so important to how I understand the world. And I think the art that our movement is able to elicit allows for people to also understand the world. Art and activism, oftentimes called social practice or socially engaged art, gives the artist and the audience a responsibility often to rethink how they even understand what's happening and how they understand social issues.
And so relatedly, maybe, where do you see your teaching and your practice, your work in the universities intersecting there?
You know, I personally, I'm not the most excited about universities and colleges, specifically the bureaucracy. But I chose to teach at Prescott College and the MFA program because I really wanted to work with working artists who had been probably working in art all their lives or social justice all their lives, or at the intersection of both, and that wanted a terminal degree and wanted to teach at the university level. And so I'm teaching about 20 students right now in 2 separate cohorts with an amazing faculty that is focusing on the visual arts world in particular. And then I have some film students and I have some theater students. And, you know, every single artist is trying to understand what is happening for them and how they want to relate to the work and the movement, to the larger movement, and to the many, many movements that have happened. And so, you know, with my academic work and my academic scholarship, I'm always interested in how other artists and activists are thinking about how this work intersects and how necessary and important it is.
So what sort of courses could universities provide that you think would be particularly important in aiding in the struggle for social justice, either domestically or abroad?
Sorry, I was reading one of the questions that came in. One more time.
So what kind of courses do you think are important for universities to provide to aid in this sort of struggle?
Well, ethnic studies all day, every day. That should be a requirement and should not be sort of like a separate thing that people go and learn, especially in those, you know, oftentimes first 2 years that you're in college or at a community college. You know, there's all these requirements, right? In order for you to move on to your specific field of study. But I always believe, you know, and many of us believe in our movement, that ethnic studies should be a requirement. Everybody should be taking ethnic studies and should understand the role of, you know, this country has played in folks of color's lives and vice versa.
Have you ever had to deal with sort of the pushback that comes with wanting to require these sorts of courses that many of us feel are so important?
Not personally. I've obviously witnessed, you know, a significant amount of pushback across the state of California, and which, you know, folks in California have won ethnic studies. But no, like not in my personal career.
And I think California just adopted, right, ethnic studies curriculum, at least in the K through 12, I believe, educate in the school system. So I know that's a big win for many people there. Yeah. So let's see. I'm starting to shift over now to a few of our to many of our audience members who are now asking a few questions. And let's see. So the first one I want to ask here is, we talk about the online visibility of Black Lives Matter in my classes. This is coming from a professor. And one of the issues that often surfaces is how it's a consistent target for disinformation campaigns. So how do you think about dealing with organized troll operations, whether and when to engage, when not to interfere with the critical work that they're doing, and how do you just manage some of that?
Yeah, it's such a great question, Jeremy. It's hard. It's difficult. There's so much misinformation and disinformation about our movement on purpose, and you know, a huge machine to feed that misinformation and disinformation. And I think what we've done is try to work inside of, you know, there's a bunch of coalitions that have been created to combat misinformation and disinformation. I don't think we're as big as we should be, but we work really hard on pushing back and challenging. And I always ask people, you know, to if you know, Jeremy, you know, you're learning about the misinformation and disinformation. So make sure you tell your family and your community. We have to be willing to do that too.
Yeah. So how do you think other people, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit. How do you think other people view Black female leadership, right? So you are a Black female leader, and I know maybe you didn't realize you'd be kind of thrust into that kind of limelight. So how do you think people view you? What are some of the challenges there? And what's your leadership style?
I think different people feel different ways. Obviously, people who know me and are close to me know the work I've done and what I do. I think for others, I'm a symbol, you know, I represent a lot to young Black girls in particular. I think for others, they may disagree with my approach, and that's normal. All those responses are pretty healthy. I think in general, people have a lot of feelings about Black women being in leadership. There's a ton of distrust for Black people in leadership, let alone Black women in leadership. And I think that has to do with anti-Black racism. I think that has to do with sexism and patriarchy. And, you know, I think there's also the added layer of me being queer. And people, you know, I don't fit the package of what a civil rights leader has historically looked like in our movement. So yeah, you know, I think there's different experiences and feelings people have around Black leadership. I think collectively, you know, we've done a lot of work around like believing in Black women's excellence and, you know, giving Black women their flowers where they're due. And sometimes we don't interrupt the harmful narratives of what of the experience of Black women, you know, and what we've experienced. And so I think that just is going to take time. It's going to take time and diligence from all of us.
So what do you see as, I guess, some of the most difficult sort of critiques that people have? Sorry, somebody's cutting trees over here. If you can hear it, I apologize. I guess this is what happens when you're from home. So sorry about that, everyone. What do you see as some of the most difficult challenges that Black women leaders sort of face in this political moment, such as yourself?
Well, whenever there is a really powerful movement, there's always a huge backlash. There's always going to be backlash. That's just part of, you know, the theory of contradictions and opposing forces. So I think, you know, we are always prepared to sort of shut something down or win something where I think we're woefully underprepared is to protect what we've won. And so it's going to be the work of all of our organizations, you know, all of us as people to really protect the wins and the gains of our movements. And that is a difficult process, but I think it's totally doable.
Yeah. So switching gears a little bit now from talking about leadership specifically, how do you think, can we talk a little bit more about what you think reparations looks like? So you talked about that a little bit earlier in one of the important things that BLM is interested in, one of the goals for the future to talk and think more proactively about that. What does that mean for you? Right? There's many people talking about it, many podcasts talking about it, a lot of commentary. What does that mean for BLM?
Well, I don't know about BLM, but
Okay.
for me, I could speak for me because we're still, you know, thinking about what it means. But I think what we agree with is that reparations needs to happen, that there needs to be a repair done for the harm that was caused for, you know, descendants of enslaved Africans. But I'll give you examples of where they're doing reparations. Number one, Chicago. Chicago's reparations case is amazing because it was a moment in which the Chicago police, under the leadership of John Burge, was completely attacking and incriminating Black men in particular, forcing them into false testimony, and then they would be imprisoned. And once the community was able to, once the community was able to prove that, they won reparations. The city ordinance that gave those people, those survivors of torture, money. They also gave their family members free community college. There's going to be a memorial dedicated to them. And there's also an entire Chicago Torture Survivor Center, the first ever US-based survivor center for US citizens. All the torture survivor centers are for people who are not from the US, because the US says that it doesn't torture people. So that's a powerful campaign that's already happened that we can actually leverage. California's doing, amazing work, passed a bill where it's going to, really promote, what would it look like to give descendants of enslaved Africans of California reparations. And then lastly, if you haven't been following the story of Bruce's Beach and the Black family who lost their property in Manhattan Beach here in the state of California, due to literally the city taking eminent domain of it, the county is now intervening to give that land back to the family. It's now worth $71 million. So that's reparations. That's what it looks like in practice.
So we have a few questions coming in. I'm trying to field a few as I ask my questions as well. So just want to tell the audience, we'll do the best we can to get through a few of them as we go through the day. So can you talk a little bit about how US-based activism links up with global struggles for equality? So thank you for that question from the audience. I was bringing that up, wanted to bring that up next. So how does US-based activism link up with global struggles for equality?
Sure. I mean, we've spent a ton of time as BLM leaders and in leadership of BLM, really, talking about the global Black struggle in particular and our relationship to other international and solidarity struggles across the globe. I've spent much of my own work, talking about international global struggles and really developing international global analysis and conversations. I've spent a ton of time across the world talking about Black Lives Matter and the role it plays in different places. We've been to Palestine, we've been to Australia, we've been to the United Kingdom, we've been to Latin America. And in all of those conversations, there is a dedication to upending anti-Blackness and upending white supremacy.
Right. Yeah. So I think, I don't know if this is a controversial question, but I want to ask a little bit about, you made mention earlier about living in a capitalist society and how it's going to be a challenge or almost impossible to make some of the inroads that we desire in the context of capitalism. So I'm just sort of paraphrasing, so please correct me if I'm wrong, kind of paraphrasing what you said. So how can you speak but you also spoke about giving money to Black businesses, small Black businesses. So can you talk a little bit about economic power and capitalism no longer being in the picture, and how do you kind of see all of those things working together?
Sure. Yeah, well, I'll start with saying that we live in a mixed system right now. So we have capitalism, but also our tax system is a form of socialism. We all pay into taxes so that, in theory, we all could collectively have the same set of social resources. And so the question is less about the kind of system that we live in, because we can get very tripped up on words like capitalism and socialism and Marxism. Obviously, throughout all the right-wing media, they have used Marxism as an ugly word to talk about me and who I am and my identity. What I'm talking about is, how do communities get their needs met? And what system is going to be the best system in place so that everybody gets their needs met? What we know about this current system and many of us felt the wrath of it because of COVID and the pandemic, was that the current system is set up so that some people fail and some people don't. It has nothing to do with your skill set, how hard you work. My mother worked 3.5 jobs. She worked to the bone and worked herself to the bone, but it didn't mean that we were getting generational wealth. It didn't mean that we were experiencing true justice, true health. And so I challenge this audience to not think in terms of, philosophical economic systems, but rather think in terms of how do you want your community and the people around you to grow up every single day? What do you want them to see, feel? What do we want people homeless? Do we want people growing hungry? What is it going to take so that everybody gets their needs met? That's the questions we should be asking ourselves.
And so with that, I'll ask a question from Louis, or maybe Louise. What obstacles do African Americans face when trying to start and grow small businesses, and how can people really support them?
Sure. And Louisa, I'm going to just assume you mean for-profit businesses, because there's lots of different kinds of businesses, right? There's the nonprofit business, which is a 501c3, which is, a business that is not about building capital. Then there's an LLC or an S Corp. That's a for-profit business that is about building capital. Then there's, 501c4 that allows you to do political action. And there's a PAC that is specific to, endorsing candidates and getting out legislation. I think in all those legal entities, there are huge barriers to, creating true equity for Black communities in particular. And those barriers have everything to do with the laws that have shut out Black people from being able to get small business loans, from being able to get the capital or have the generational wealth to build something from the ground up. For people who are, entrepreneurs in this space, or who are small business owners or even nonprofit leaders, how difficult it is to get resources to try to do the things that you believe that are so important to do to help humanity if you don't already have a leg up, or if the laws are stacked against you.
So kind of pulling this out to a more global perspective, has BLM ever considered applying for United Nations NGO accreditation and support or assistance? And are you interested in that? Someone asked, but what are your thoughts? Are you more, you spoke before about corporations and other people sort of coming to you with no strings attached. So how do you guys sort of think and see collaborations on that scale or funding?
No, we've never considered being an NGO of the UN. I'm curious about what that would look like, what that would mean, and how that would benefit us. I just have a ton of questions versus response.
Yeah. So the person who asked, you could ask them another question to follow up.
Yeah, or if you just clarify what it would mean and why would that, I'm not in a judgmental way, but curious, like how would that benefit BLM? And I'm really interested in answering Viraj's question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
Which is, what is BLM doing in terms of drug legalization and how marijuana laws have targeted people of color? We aren't specifically doing anything. I did spend a ton of my time in California pushing and passing Prop 64, which is the legalization of marijuana in California. And, it was controversial, but I think it was really important. I am personally working on a Black cannabis fund and really looking at how we could build equity inside of Black communities through cannabis, as well as helping think about how we move dollars from the Black Cannabis Fund into organizations who are leading that work. So, and the next kind of part of my work and career, it's really helping find the resources to get to the ground for the people who are already doing the work.
So we have 10 minutes left, so I want to ask a few sort of bigger questions here now. Someone asked, what do you see really as the goal of social justice? That's a big one, but what do you see
Yeah.
as the goal of
Well,
social justice?
it's a good question. Um, I think there's two things here. One is, social justice has a lot of different pillars. My focus is abolition. My focus is, to really focus on a world where we don't rely on police and prisons as a way to deal with harm and violence, and that we readjust how we relate to harm and violence, and how we relate to people and their needs. So that's my focus.
So you see, there are many different ways people can attack the goal of social justice, and you're just saying that is your particular interest and goal these days.
Yeah, because social justice is broad. There's, social BLMs inside the social justice movement, the women's movement. I mean, there's so many, the environmental justice movement. My particular focus is abolition.
And where do you see, we're going to talk a little bit about BLM again now, where do you see, or what is your vision for BLM in the next 5 to 10 years from today?
Oh, I think for sure in the next 5 to 10 years, BLM will continue to be a very powerful and robust movement. I think I will be transitioned out of BLM by that time. I have a ton of work that I want to be doing in the world of storytelling and the world of developing abolitionist work. I'm very interested at the intersection of art and food justice. And so I think it's always important for organizations and their leadership to transition, to let new leaders in. And so I think that's where, I'll be heading as BLM continues to move forward.
So you do other work as well, right? So can you talk a little bit about your work with Reform LA Jails and Dignity Empowering Them?
Yeah, well, Reform LA Jails, I'm no longer a part of, but I ran Reform LA Jails for 2 years. It was a ballot measure that won successfully 73%, which is unprecedented. And that ballot measure focused on creating more psychiatric care for people who are specifically experiencing mental illness and providing the current civilian oversight body of the Sheriff's Department subpoena power, legal power to subpoena the sheriff and subpoena documents.
So what do you see as action that companies can take to really invest in and uplifting Black communities, Black students, et cetera? And how can we hold them more accountable? I think that's sort of a big piece of it as well.
I think so much of the work that we've seen over the last, from last summer to now has been a big reckoning for a lot of companies, a lot of schools, a lot of people around what kind of world, what kind of vision do we want to live in? And how do we do that together? And that together takes a ton of communication, a ton of conversations, and then in those conversations, creating action, real life action around how we support. And it really depends on what your interests are. It really depends on what you feel most excited by, what you feel most moved by, what you feel most concerned about, what keeps you up at night. What are your, most, what are the things that make you want to just like holler and make you want to change it immediately? And that's usually a thing that you should be working on. That's what I did.
Yeah. So one person asked here, as you sort of deal with different things coming in, some of the onslaughts that you spoke about earlier, how are you really keeping yourself well? And do you have a particular faith that you base your beliefs in or your worldviews off of?
I've done a lot. I really practice a lot of different things. When I'm in really reflective moments, I do a lot of meditation. I've done a lot of silent meditation retreats. And I also am a big fan of somatics therapy. And so I do a lot of, centering and grounding practices that help me really be in my body and help me understand the kind of work that I want to be doing, and reminds me, why I do this work in the first place.
So throughout some of the questions, a lot of people are asking questions about policing and reform and all that. So I won't sort of ask some of those similar questions again, but I kind of want to end here asking you about what are your feelings post verdict? The verdict I'm talking about. We at Lehigh had a sort of reflective time last week after the verdict, just to sort of process it. And what are your thoughts, and how have you been processing things? And moving forward, what does it mean for you?
I think the verdict was a victory for the movement. Verdicts aren't justice, verdicts aren't accountability, because at the very same time as the verdict is being read, a young Black girl, is murdered, Makia Bryant. And so in some ways, the verdict was sort of like the sigh of relief. And then in other ways, you're like, oh, but this is going to keep going unless we really do the work necessary to challenge the police and to challenge the apparatus that protects the police. So I have a lot of feelings about the verdict. I think a lot about what the verdict would look like in an abolitionist world. We wouldn't have a court system to even deal with that. We wouldn't have police. Derek Chauvin wouldn't have been able to kill George if we lived in an abolitionist context. So it feels really important to give myself the opportunity to also dream bigger and not just sort of be in the rat race of verdict after verdict and calling for, the prosecution of police, as if the prosecution of police is ultimately going to really, give us the things that we need and we're asking for.
So Lehigh as an institution is really attempting to transform itself into becoming an anti-racist institution. Are there any words of advice or wisdom of how we might achieve such a goal?
That's a very good question.
Yeah.
You have to start where you can. The first set of conversations around being an anti-racist institution is figuring out the ways that you're a racist institution. Figure out the ways that you've blocked people from being in leadership or have not allowed for, Black, brown, queer, trans folks to be at the table. There's a lot of times where, PWIs talk about wanting to be anti-racist, and if you look around and you look in a boardroom and it's everybody who's white, this is one of the first places to look at is your own leadership. Who's in it, who's not, why? What was it, the Wells Fargo CEO that was like, we want to hire Black people, that just nobody applies, there's not enough qualified Black people. And so we have to challenge all the ways that we have created a narrative about Black folks and what's possible and what we can do and what we can't do.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, we've really enjoyed our time with you in this last hour. Thank you so much. I just want to ask if there's any words of charge or anything that you would like to give us as we close here in thinking about what we collectively and also individually can do as we charge forward on our fight towards justice.
Keep showing up even when it's incredibly uncomfortable and it feels like your skin's crawling and like you can't tolerate it. Keep showing up, because if the intention is to be transformative and to transform your institution and yourselves into people who are going to provide an equal society, an equitable society for all people, it's worth it. The work is worth it.
Well, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and that you chose to spend it with us for this hour. And we really wish you well in all your endeavors. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Bye, everyone.
Bye, it was a pleasure.